The summer breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmines through Highland Park, where the Chen family's two-story brick house stood proud among rows of well-maintained homes. James Chen stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the early morning joggers pass by. His gentle smile reflected in the window as he thought about how far he'd come since moving to this neighborhood 5 years ago. At 45, James had built everything he'd ever dreamed of: a successful career, a loving family, and a home in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. But it wasn't the marble countertops or the perfectly trimmed lawn that made him proud. It was the sense of community he and his family had built over the years. His wife Sarah's humming floated in from the dining room, where she sat surrounded by colorful invitation cards for their upcoming annual BBQ. Her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she carefully wrote each neighbor's name in her elegant handwriting. This wasn't just any gathering. It was their signature event that had grown from a small backyard cookout to the highlight of the neighborhood's social calendar. "Dad, look what I made." 12-year-old Emily bounced into the kitchen, holding up a hand-drawn poster for the BBQ. Her dark ponytail swung with excitement as she showed off her artwork, complete with drawings of hamburgers and hot dogs with tiny smiley faces. James couldn't help but chuckle at his daughter's creativity. Sarah joined them, wrapping an arm around Emily's shoulders. "That's beautiful, honey. We'll definitely hang it up at the party." She turned to James, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I've added some new names to the guest list this year. The Patels just moved in down the street, and there's that nice elderly couple from the corner house." James nodded, remembering how nervous they'd been about hosting their first BBQ 5 years ago. Back then, they were the newcomers, unsure if their neighbors would welcome a Chinese-American family in this predominantly white neighborhood. But year after year, their BBQ had become something special, a place where barriers broke down over plates of James's famous honey-glazed ribs and Sarah's secret recipe potato salad. The Chen family had transformed their backyard into more than just a party space. It had become a place where children from different backgrounds played together, where elderly neighbors found company, and where new families were welcomed into the community. James's grilling skills had become legendary, and Sarah's way of making everyone feel special had earned her the unofficial title of neighborhood ambassador. As James helped Emily hang her poster on the fridge, he noticed a moving truck pulling up to the house next door. "Looks like we have new neighbors," he said, watching as a woman in crisp designer clothes directed the movers with sharp gestures. "We should add them to the guest list, too." Sarah peeked out the window and smiled. "Of course. Nothing welcomes people better than a good BBQ. I'll make them a welcome basket tomorrow." Little did the Chen family know that their new neighbor, Karen Wheeler, would test not just their hospitality but their entire community's spirit. As Emily skipped off to finish her homework and Sarah returned to her invitations, James lingered by the window, watching the movers unload furniture. He had no idea that this year's BBQ would become the most memorable one yet, for reasons no one could have predicted. The morning sun cast long shadows across their lawn, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed to life. It was just another peaceful day in Highland Park, but change was coming, the kind that would reveal the true character of not just the Chens, but their entire community. The morning before the big BBQ, Sarah Chen was arranging colorful paper lanterns in their backyard when she heard the sharp click of heels on the sidewalk. Looking up, she saw their new neighbor, Karen Wheeler, marching toward their fence with a determined look on her face that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Karen had moved in just 2 weeks ago, but she'd already made quite an impression on the neighborhood. Her designer sunglasses perched on her nose like a shield, and her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move an inch in the breeze. She carried herself like someone used to getting her way. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice carrying across the yard like a warning bell. "We need to talk about this event you're planning." She said the word event as if it left a bad taste in her mouth. Sarah put down the lanterns and walked over, putting on her friendliest smile. Through their kitchen window, Emily had stopped doing her homework and pressed her face against the glass, watching the scene unfold. Her math textbook lay forgotten on the table. "Hello, Karen. I'm so glad you're here. I was actually going to bring over your invitation today," Sarah said warmly, reaching for the envelope in her back pocket. But before she could pull it out, Karen cut her off with a sharp wave of her manicured hand. "That won't be necessary," Karen said, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm here to discuss my concerns. Do you realize how much smoke these kinds of gatherings create? And the noise." She glanced around the yard with obvious disapproval, not to mention the type of people who might show up. The pause before people hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. Sarah felt her cheeks grow hot, but years of dealing with subtle prejudice had taught her to keep her composure. Behind the window, Emily's eyes widened and her small hands balled into fists. "Our guests are our friends and neighbors," Sarah replied carefully. "Many of them are doctors, lawyers, teachers." "Look," Karen interrupted, leaning closer to the fence. "I paid a premium for this property, and I won't have my property values affected by your little gathering. I've already spoken to several other neighbors who share my concerns." She adjusted her designer handbag, a movement that seemed practiced for maximum intimidation. Sarah knew very well that was a lie. Their BBQ was loved by everyone in the neighborhood. Even Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything, looked forward to it each year. But Karen wasn't finished. "I've taken pictures of your setup," she continued, pulling out her phone. "If this gets out of hand, I won't hesitate to call the authorities. I know people in the city council, you know." Emily couldn't take it anymore. She burst out of the house, her dark ponytail flying behind her. "Mom, don't let her ruin our BBQ. Everyone loves it." Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and tears. Karen's eyes narrowed at Emily's outburst. "You should teach your daughter better manners," she said coldly, then turned on her heel and walked away, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and tension in the air. Sarah quickly hugged Emily, who was shaking with emotion. "It's okay, sweetie. Nothing's going to ruin our BBQ." But inside, she felt a knot of worry. She needed to talk to James about this. As if on cue, James's car pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, his tie loosened after a long day at work, and immediately sensed something was wrong. The sight of his wife and daughter hugging in the yard, with Emily trying to hide her tears, made him pause. What James didn't know was that this confrontation would lead to one of the most powerful moments their neighborhood had ever seen. His secret, the one he'd kept quiet about for years, was about to change everything. But for now, he simply walked toward his family, ready to hear what had happened, and more importantly, ready to stand up for what was right. Inside their cozy living room, James listened carefully as Sarah and Emily told him about Karen's threats. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, still upset, while Sarah paced back and forth, her usual calm replaced by nervous energy. The evening sun cast long shadows through their windows, making the moment feel even more serious. "Maybe we should cancel," Sarah said softly, stopping to look at their family photos on the wall. 20 years of memories smiled back at her. Their wedding, Emily's first steps, countless happy moments. "I don't want to cause trouble." James stood up slowly, straightening his tie. A small smile played on his lips, the kind he usually wore when he was about to turn a bad situation around in court. He'd spent 20 years fighting battles bigger than this, though his family didn't know the full extent of his work. "We're not canceling anything," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Emily looked up at her father, hope returning to her eyes. "In fact, I have a better idea. Emily, could you get me Mrs. Wheeler's invitation from your mom's desk?" Emily jumped up and ran to get it, her ponytail bouncing with renewed energy. When she returned, James took out his gold pen, the one he used to sign important court documents. He started writing a personal note on the invitation. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, peering over his shoulder. "Something I learned long ago," James replied, his handwriting flowing across the paper. When someone shows you their worst, you show them your best. We're not just going to invite her. We're going to make her feel especially welcome." Emily's mouth dropped open. But Dad, she was so mean to Mom. She threatened to call the police. James chuckled, a warm, knowing sound that always made his family feel safe. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the best way to fight darkness is with light. And trust me, I know a thing or two about handling situations like this." He hadn't told many people about his work as a civil rights attorney. To his neighbors, he was just James Chen, the friendly lawyer who made amazing BBQ ribs. They didn't know about the landmark cases he'd won, the families he'd helped, or the policies he'd helped change. He preferred to let his actions speak louder than his credentials. "Tomorrow," he continued, sealing the envelope with care, "we're going to host the best BBQ this neighborhood has ever seen. And Mrs. Wheeler, she's going to learn something important about judging books by their covers." Sarah watched her husband with growing curiosity. There was something in his confidence that she hadn't seen before, a quiet strength that made her wonder what he was planning. "Emily," James called, "would you like to help me get the special spices ready for tomorrow? I think it's time to use the secret recipe." Emily's face lit up. Her father's secret BBQ recipe was legendary in their family, though he rarely used all the special ingredients. "Really? The one Grandpa taught you?" "Really," James nodded, heading to the kitchen with Emily bouncing behind him. "And Sarah, honey, why don't you call Judge Thompson and Police Chief Rodriguez? Tell them to come a bit earlier than the others. I have a feeling we might need some friendly faces right at the start." Sarah raised an eyebrow, beginning to understand. Her husband hadn't survived 20 years as a lawyer without learning how to handle difficult situations with grace. As she watched him and Emily pulling spices from the cabinet, she heard him teaching their daughter something more important than a recipe. "Remember, Emily," he said, measuring out paprika, "when people try to make you feel small, stand tall. When they expect anger, show kindness. And when they're watching for your worst, give them your very best." The kitchen filled with the warm scent of spices as father and daughter worked together. Outside, the sun was setting on Highland Park, and somewhere down the street, Karen Wheeler was probably planning her next move. But in the Chen household, there was no fear, only the quiet confidence of a family who knew that love and dignity could overcome any prejudice. Little did Karen know, she was about to learn one of life's most important lessons, served up with the best BBQ she'd ever tasted. The day of the BBQ arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself wanted to support the Chen family. By early afternoon, their backyard had transformed into a festive paradise. Colorful lanterns swayed in the gentle breeze, and the smell of James's secret recipe BBQ sauce filled the air, making mouths water 3 houses down. Sarah arranged the last of the fresh flowers on the buffet table when she spotted Karen Wheeler through the fence. Their neighbor stood in her yard wearing an expensive summer dress, phone in hand, taking pictures of the setup while speaking to someone with dramatic hand gestures. Emily, helping to set up the drink station, noticed too. "Mom, she's doing it again," Emily whispered, but Sarah just smiled, remembering James's calm confidence from the night before. The first guests started arriving right on time. Just as James had planned, Judge Thompson's silver Mercedes pulled up first. The distinguished-looking African-American judge, known for his brilliant legal mind and booming laugh, stepped out carrying his famous peach cobbler. "James, my boy," Judge Thompson called out, embracing him. 20 years we've been working together, and your BBQ still brings me running." His voice carried clearly across both yards, and Sarah noticed Karen lower her phone slightly, her expression shifting from smug to uncertain. Minutes later, Police Chief Rodriguez arrived with his family, his police cruiser parked right in front of the Chen's house. "James," he called out, walking through the gate with a big wave, "my whole department's been talking about your BBQ all week." Karen's phone was completely lowered now, and she seemed to be having second thoughts about her planned disruption. But the parade of impressive guests was just beginning. Dr. Sarah Ming, the head of cardiac surgery at the city's best hospital, arrived next with her wife. Then came Professor Williams, whose economic theories were regularly featured in national news, a state senator, 3 local business leaders, and even the city's beloved retired fire chief, all greeting James and Sarah like old friends. Emily watched with growing pride as more guests arrived. Her teachers, neighbors, families from her school, and friends from every background imaginable. The backyard filled with laughter, conversation, and the kind of warmth that no amount of prejudice could chill. Karen remained frozen in her yard, her phone now clutched uselessly at her side. The type of people she had worried about turned out to be some of the most respected individuals in the city. The noise she had complained about was the sound of children playing and adults enjoying meaningful conversation. The smoke she had feared was carrying the mouth-watering aroma of perfectly grilled food that was making her own stomach growl. James worked his magic at the grill, flipping burgers and basting ribs while chatting easily with guests. He hadn't just invited people, he had invited his history, his professional network, his entire community. Each person there represented a piece of the life he had built through hard work and integrity. A young boy ran past Karen's fence, chasing bubbles being blown by a girl in a hijab. Behind them, a grandmother in a sari taught a freckled teenager how to fold napkins into swans. At the dessert table, a Ravi and an imam were good-naturedly arguing over whose wife made the better baklava. The scene was everything Karen had feared, yet nothing like she had imagined. Instead of chaos, there was harmony. Instead of disruption, there was community. The perfectly orchestrated gathering was a living, breathing testament to everything Highland Park could be at its best. Sarah noticed Karen's confusion and internal struggle. Following her husband's example of kindness, she picked up a plate of James's freshly grilled ribs, still steaming and glistening with his secret sauce. With Emily watching curiously, Sarah headed toward their fence. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the chance to transform an enemy into a neighbor. The afternoon sun painted everything in a golden light, and the sound of happiness filled the air. But the most significant moment of the BBQ was about to unfold as Sarah approached Karen with an offering of peace, served with a side of the best ribs in Highland Park. Just as Sarah reached the fence with the plate of ribs, 2 police cars slowly rolled up to the curb. Karen's face lit up with triumph, but her victory was short-lived. Instead of storming the party, the officers stepped out with broad smiles, carrying covered dishes. "Sorry we're late, James," Officer Martinez called out, holding up what looked like her grandmother's famous enchiladas. "Had to finish our shift, but we wouldn't miss your BBQ for anything." Karen's mouth fell open as Police Chief Rodriguez walked over to greet his officers, then turned to her with a warm but knowing smile. "Mrs. Wheeler, isn't it? I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Chief Rodriguez. James here has been our department's go-to legal advisor for years. Pro bono work, you know." The man's a saint. Emily, who had sneaked closer to watch, could barely contain her giggles at Karen's shocked expression. The woman who had been so confident with her threats just yesterday now stood speechless, her phone hanging limply at her side. "Did you know," Chief Rodriguez continued, gesturing toward James at the grill, "that your neighbor there wrote the handbook on community policing that we use to train our officers? His work has helped build bridges between law enforcement and communities all across the state." Sarah still stood by the fence, holding the plate of ribs. She could see Karen's perfectly maintained facade starting to crack. The woman's eyes darted between the police cars, the diverse crowd of prestigious guests, and James, who was now laughing with Judge Thompson as they flipped burgers together. I didn't realize," Karen stammered, her designer sunglasses slipping slightly down her nose. "Oh, James never talks about it," Sarah said kindly, finally extending the plate of ribs across the fence. "He believes actions speak louder than words. Would you like to try some? It's his secret recipe." The aroma of the perfectly grilled ribs wafted up, making resistance impossible. Karen hesitated for a moment. then reached out and took the plate with slightly trembling hands. Just then, a small commotion broke out by the grill. A group of children had surrounded James, chanting, "Speech! Speech!" The adults joined in, and soon everyone was calling for James to say a few words. James wiped his hands on his Kiss the Cook apron, looking slightly embarrassed but happy. As he cleared his throat to speak, Karen found herself drawn closer to the fence to listen. "You know," James began, his voice carrying across the yard, "when I first moved to this neighborhood, someone told me I wouldn't fit in." Gentle knowing laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I learned long ago that community isn't about fitting in. It's about standing together. Every person here today has helped make Highland Park not just a neighborhood, but a family." He paused, looking around at the faces of his guests, the judge who had mentored him, the police officers he trained, the neighbors who had become friends, and even Karen, still standing by her fence with a plate of his ribs. "In my work," he continued, "I've seen how fear and misunderstanding can divide us. But I've also seen how sharing a meal, having a conversation, or simply being kind to one another can heal those divisions. That's what this BBQ has always been about." Emily watched as tears formed in Karen's eyes. The woman's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the emotion on her face as she looked down at the plate of ribs in her hands, a simple offering of friendship she had almost rejected. Chief Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on Karen's shoulder. "You know," he said quietly, "there's plenty of room at the tables. Why don't you join us? James' ribs are best when they're hot, and I hear his wife's potato salad is out of this world." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and the lanterns were starting to twinkle in the growing dusk. At that moment, Highland Park wasn't divided into us and them, old and new, or any other categories. It was just neighbors, sharing food, laughter, and the simple joy of being together. The evening air grew cooler as James stepped away from the grill, ready to share more than just good food with his neighbors. The lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathering, and everyone could sense something special was about to happen. Even Karen had quietly slipped through the gate and found a seat near the back, still holding her plate of ribs. Emily sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket with her friends, watching her father with shining eyes. She'd never seen him speak in front of so many people before. Sarah stood nearby, her heart swelling with pride, as James cleared his throat to address the crowd. "You know," James began, his voice gentle but clear, "for 20 years, I've kept pretty quiet about what I do beyond just being a lawyer. But today, I think it's time to share something with all of you." He paused, looking around at the faces of his neighbors, faces of every color, age, and background. "When I was a young boy," he continued, "my father ran a small restaurant in Chinatown. One day, some people tried to force him out, saying people like us didn't belong there. But a lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Thompson, yes, the father of our Judge Thompson here," he nodded toward the judge, who raised his glass with a knowing smile, "took our case for free. He didn't just save our family business. He showed me what justice really means." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the children stopped playing to listen. "That's why I became a civil rights attorney," James revealed, his words touching hearts across the yard. "Every case I've taken, every policy I've helped change, has been about making sure no child ever feels they don't belong, no family ever faces discrimination alone." He walked over to a large portfolio that Sarah had helped him prepare. "In this folder are some of the cases I'm most proud of. The Johnson family lawsuit that helped integrate our city schools. The Martinez case that changed hiring policies in our police department. The Sane family's victory that protected religious freedom in our workplaces." Karen's hands trembled slightly as she realized these weren't just cases. They were stories about real people, some of whom were sitting right there in the yard, enjoying the BBQ with their families. "But my proudest achievement," James smiled, looking around, "isn't in any legal document. It's this, right here, looking at all of you, sharing food and friendship, watching our children play together without seeing differences, hearing laughter in a dozen different accents. This is what justice looks like in real life. Emily noticed tears in several people's eyes, including Karen's. The woman who had threatened to call the authorities was now sitting quietly, her half-eaten rib forgotten on her plate as she listened. "You see," James continued, his voice growing warmer, "law books can change rules, but only communities can change hearts. Every time we choose understanding over fear, every time we reach out instead of pulling away, we make our neighborhood stronger." He walked over to where Karen sat and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, surprising everyone, especially her. "And our community always has room for one more friend. Always has room for new beginnings." Karen looked up at him, mascara slightly smudged, and managed a small, genuine smile, perhaps her first real smile since moving to Highland Park. Judge Thompson stood up, raising his glass. "To James Chen," he announced in his powerful voice, "who never forgot the lesson my father taught him. That justice is served not just in courtrooms, but in backyards, over good food and open hearts." The crowd raised their glasses in toast, and even the children lifted their juice boxes. The moment was magical, string lights twinkling, faces glowing, hearts opening. In that moment, they weren't just neighbors sharing a meal. They were witnesses to the power of kindness to transform lives. As James walked back to the grill, people began approaching him one by one, to thank him, to share their own stories, or just to shake his hand. Emily watched with pride as her father, the quiet hero she never knew she had, showed everyone that the greatest victories don't always come from fighting battles, but from building bridges. 3 weeks after the memorable BBU, Highland Park was a changed neighborhood. The morning sun shone down on Karen Wheeler as she stood nervously on the Chen's front porch, holding a freshly baked apple pie. Her designer clothes were replaced by casual wear, and her usual sharp expression had softened into something more genuine. Sarah opened the door, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air between them. I baked this," Karen said softly, her voice different from the harsh tone she'd used before. "It's not much, but I wanted to apologize properly." Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, where just weeks ago Emily had watched their first confrontation through the window. Now, Emily bounded down the stairs, and to everyone's surprise, gave Karen a quick hug before grabbing a cookie from the jar. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Karen began, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I was scared of change, of different people, of losing what I thought made this neighborhood special. I was so wrong." Her voice cracked slightly. "The things I said, the way I acted, I'm deeply ashamed." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Karen's hand. "The past is the past," she said warmly. "What matters is what we do next." As if on cue, James walked in from his morning jog. "Perfect timing," he said, smiling at Karen. "We were just about to discuss this year's fall festival. The neighborhood association needs volunteers." Karen's eyes lit up. "Actually," she said, sitting straighter, "I have some experience planning events. In my old neighborhood." She paused, realizing how much she'd changed. "Well, let's just say I'd love to help, if you'll have me." Over the next few months, Highland Park witnessed an incredible transformation. Karen, once the neighborhood's biggest critic, became one of its most active community members. She and Sarah started a weekly coffee morning where neighbors could drop in and chat. The gatherings grew larger each week, filled with stories, laughter, and friendship. Emily came home one day to find Karen teaching her mom how to make her award-winning apple pie, while James added the recipe to his growing neighborhood cookbook project. The kitchen was full of flour and giggles, a far cry from the tension that had filled it just months before. When autumn arrived, the fall festival was the biggest the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen and Sarah co-chaired the planning committee, turning the event into a celebration of Highland Park's diversity. Food stalls featured dishes from every culture in the neighborhood, and James's BBQ station still had the longest line. But the most touching moment came during the festival's opening speech. Karen stood before the crowd, her voice clear and strong. "A few months ago, I was new here, afraid of what I didn't understand. But this community, especially the Chen family, showed me that the best neighborhoods aren't built with fences and fear. They're built with open hearts and helping hands." She turned to James and Sarah, tears in her eyes. "You could have responded to my prejudice with anger. Instead, you responded with kindness and wisdom. You didn't just change my mind, you changed my heart." The following summer, as the Chens prepared for their annual BBQ, they had an extra set of hands helping out. Karen arrived early, wearing her own Kiss the Cook apron, ready to learn James's secret red recipe. Emily taught her how to hang the lanterns just right, while Sarah showed her the perfect way to arrange the buffet table. As the sun set on another perfect Highland Park evening, James looked around his backyard. Children of all backgrounds played together, their laughter mixing with the sound of friendly conversation. Karen was showing a new neighbor around, making sure they felt welcome, just as she wished someone had done for her. "You know," James said to Sarah, watching this scene of harmony, "sometimes the biggest changes start with just one plate of ribs." Sarah smiled, leaning against her husband. "And a whole lot of love," she added, as their neighborhood continued to grow, not just in size, but in understanding, acceptance, and the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in property values, the wealth of true community.